Welcome to chapter 23 of the book of Isaiah. I'm Clark Dunlap, discipleship pastor at Calvary Baptist in Rosenberg, Texas. And we're going through the Isaiah Sunday School lessons from Lifeway, and we're in chapter 23 today. I'm glad you could join us. If you have your Bible, Isaiah 23. Now, we know Isaiah spoke for God, right? Prophet of God spoke for God. Who did he talk to? Ever thought of that? Who was he talking to? Was God talking to everybody by way of Isaiah? Did he have him travel the world? No. He's God's prophet to the people of Judah. We see that in the first chapter, but we see it repeated throughout the book. He speaks to Judah's kings with the authority of a prophet, almost as he's another king, almost on that level. He speaks with great confidence when he prophesies to the kings of Judah and to the people of Judah. He may talk about a lot of other nations, but he's talking to God's people. Judah and the people of Jerusalem are God's people. Now, in chapters 8 through 23, we looked at chapter 7 last week, and we're jumping way over to 23. But this passage 8 through 23 is often called the prophecies to the nations, or the woes to the nations from Isaiah. Many messages. He talks about countries like Babylon, Moab, Israel, Egypt, Ethiopia. There's some others in there, but he talked about a lot of countries. He was addressing his words to Judah, to God's people. Judah was God's country on the earth. Who do you reckon is God's country today? Is it the United States of America? Hey, maybe it's China. I have heard reports that there are more Christians in China than in the United States. Maybe it's Israel. There is an Israel still to this day. I'll tell you what I believe. I believe Jesus is King of kings, but he is Lord over the church. All the people of God, redeemed by the blood of the Lord Jesus Christ, no matter their ethnicity, no matter their country, no matter where in the world they are God's people. Now, I'm not saying he's done completely with Israel. Apparently, he's got more for them in the future. But it's the church that are the true offspring of Abraham, people of faith. And so God's got a people today, and it's the body of Christ. Now, in chapter 23, this is the last chapter of those prophecies to the nations. And here Isaiah will talk about Tyre. Now, in the first 7 verses, he talks about how Tyre and Sidon will be laid waste and how this is going to affect many countries. Tyre and Sidon are cities, not a nation. They're the 2 chief cities of an area called Phoenicia. Was a country, got overrun a few times, but Tyre and Sidon, they were just north of Israel and right on the coast of modern-day Lebanon. And they show up numerous times in Scripture. In the time of David and Solomon, for instance, they were very involved in the building of David's home, but in the building of the temple in the time of Solomon. There was trade going on. There seemed to be peace between them. And then later, they're mentioned by other prophets besides Isaiah. They're in the New Testament. Jesus talked about them, referred to them, and visited that area. Did you know that? That Jesus went to Tyre and Sidon? You can find that in Mark 7, among other places. But then, after those first 7 verses, when he's talking about what's about to happen to Tyre and Sidon, he asks a question, an important question in our understanding of God. You know, the word theology and the word history often scare people. History is boring to a lot of people. Theology is just too fancy. I just want to believe the Bible. I don't need this theology stuff. Well, all theology is talking right about God. the right words, the right study of who God is. And that's what we do when we're studying the Bible and learning about God. We're doing theology. And so, if you'll follow along with me, chapter 23, I'm going to start reading in verse 8. I'm going to read down through 12. Are you ready? Who has purposed this against Tyre? There's the question. Who purposed all this destruction to happen? Tyre, the bestower of crowns, whose merchants were princes, whose traders were the honored of the earth. And he answers this question in verse 9. The Lord of hosts purposed it, to defile the pompous pride of all their glory, to dishonor all the honored of the earth. Cross over your land like the Nile, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no restraint anymore. He has stretched out his hand over the sea. He has shaken the kingdoms. The Lord has given command concerning Canaan to destroy its strongholds. And he said, You will no more exult, O oppressed virgin daughter of Sidon. Arise, cross over to Cyprus. Even there you will have no rest. Okay, I'm going to unpack this a little bit, but it has kind of a dire sound to it, doesn't it? The first thing we learn about God here, I want to point out, is that God is a just God. He is a righteous God in all that he does, and he's justified when he takes judgment to a country, to a people. Deuteronomy 32:4 says that he is a rock, his work is perfect, all his ways are justice. He is a God of truth without iniquity, and he is just and right in all of his ways. God is justified in his dealings with any nation or people group. Is God justified to bring judgment on the United States? If he does it, he's justified. Okay? Some people think, well, the USA, we're a Christian nation. Surely God won't judge us. Do you think if judgment began to fall on us, people would understand that we're not the Christian nation they thought we were? Do you think that God may have already started judgment on this country? Verse 8 says, Who purposed this? That's a powerful question. He didn't say, now who let this happen? Or who just had this sudden idea to do something and did it? No. Who purposed? Whose plan is behind this destruction? Well, obviously, it's God who has purposed, planned, worked this to come about, to happen. Remember last week in chapter 7, and he's telling the king, he said, listen, you're afraid of these two other kings that might come and destroy you. God said, it won't happen. There's a situation when God purposed that something would not happen. Here, God says, I purposed this to happen. Why did he purpose this? Well, verse 9 talks about their pompous pride and their earthly honor. There's two reasons right there. Verse 8 points out that Tyre was like a kingmaker. It was a bestower of crowns. You know, if there was a new king in a certain area, a new country, maybe over in Greece or over in North Africa, anyway, and he didn't get along good with the merchants of Tyre. Maybe there was a conflict there and he was trying to push them around. You know, they could make life, they had enough power, they could make life very disciplined, very difficult. They could maybe even depose a ruler when that ruler wasn't able to have their ships go and trade and bring prosperity to their people. The people might just overthrow, or somebody else rise up as a usurper and overthrow that king so that he could get the job done. Tyre had that much power. Their merchants were like royalty in the world, as they were treated. When they would travel to another place, or maybe even when merchants came to them, they felt treated like royalty because that's how much power Tyre had. And so they're a bestower of crowns, and they are so prideful. When we get caught up in pride, when people get caught up in pride, they don't need God, right? It's almost like, I'm enough. I'm God for me. Well, God doesn't tolerate that. Pride goeth before destruction. Okay? And so for their pride and the way they were honored in the earth like royalty, like bigger than God himself, God is going to judge them. That's not the only reason mentioned. In verse 11 we just read, he mentioned how God had a command regarded that regarded the strongholds of Canaan. What's that talking about? God led Moses to lead the Israelites out of bondage in Egypt into the promised land. We know it took a long time, took all those years in the wilderness, but they were to go in and drive the people out of Canaan. Okay? The Canaanites. Now there was the Perizzites and the Jebusites, and there were other groups, but overall this was Canaanite country, and they were to drive these people out. You know, Sidon is one of those two cities named after a guy named Sidon who was the son of Canaan. So these are Canaanite cities. And in Joshua chapter 1, around verse 3 and verse 4, in fact, I have it right here. Let me read what God told Joshua. He reminds Joshua as he take over that God is giving them the land from Lebanon, that's Tyre and Sidon, all the way to the wilderness, which is way south, all the way to the Euphrates, which is far in the east, and all the way to the Great Sea or the Mediterranean, which is right there, the coastline of Israel. God reminded Joshua, I'm giving you this land, and that included Tyre and Sidon. So there's their pride and their honor in the earth that was just over the top. There is the fact that God had already said these are Canaanite strongholds that need to be put down. And the last thing is, we haven't read it yet, but down in verse 16 and 17, we're going to see Tyre compared to a prostitute. Now, why is that comparison? Well, it could be prostitution for money, which was evil, which was wicked, but it could also be prostitution in the sense of religion. Now, the Bible likens idolatry to prostitution, to unfaithfulness of a bride, that kind of thing. Not only is it similar to that, or likened to that, or called that, the idolatry, but in Phoenicia, they worshipped the Baals. They worshipped Ishtar. Now, Ishtar is a forerunner of Isis. It's also related to where we get the word Easter, as a matter of fact. And so Ishtar was worshipped, and they had temples and they made sacrifices. But one of the things that we see in some of their temples, and there's a lot of debate about how rampant this was, but it existed, was temple prostitution. In other words, sex is a worship form for these false gods. Okay? That's evil. That's just evil. All righty? That is not what God intended. So he likens them to prostitutes. And so we link that with the idea that God wanted the Canaanite strongholds to be brought down. Well, this is one of the reasons the Canaanites worshipped false gods, and their evil was just getting over the top by the time God brought Israel in. Now, this is many years later, but Tyre and Sidon had never been dealt with. And their pride was over the top. And so we have a number of reasons why God is justified in bringing judgment to Tyre and Sidon. Now, before we move on, he mentions in here Tarshish. Okay, now what is that about? If you remember the story of Jonah, Jonah got a word from God to go prophesy against Nineveh, which was over in Assyria. Okay, same countries we're talking about. But Jonah didn't want to go. In fact, he said, I'm going to go somewhere else. And he goes down to the city of Joppa, which is on the coast of Israel. And it's a little port. It's not a big port, but they can catch a boat there. And he wants to go to Tarshish. You know what that's really saying? He wants to get as far away from God as he knows how to get. Tarshish, there's a couple of ideas that it might have been closer, near Italy, near Carthage, something like that. But Tarshish is believed to be in Spain. In fact, it's believed to be in very southern Spain, but kind of on the southwestern edge. And so while the nation of Israel and Tyre and Sidon and those cities and Phoenicia were way on the eastern border, the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. As you travel across the Mediterranean, you go by Greece, you go by the big boot of Italy, you got Africa down there on the southern edge, and it kind of comes up some places, and Europe is kind of all over the place, and then down comes Spain over there, and up comes Africa, and there's a point, it's called the Strait of Gibraltar. That's where you would exit the Mediterranean and be in the Atlantic Ocean. All right, and it is so close, even though a lot of the Mediterranean is hundreds of miles across. Down there, it's so close that you can see across the Strait of Gibraltar. You could stand in Africa and see Europe. It's the southern coast of Spain. You can stand in Gibraltar and see Africa from Europe. And that's something, so that's how close they are. So right around outside, once you pass Gibraltar, there's a large natural harbor there. The city of Rota, Spain is in there. And they believe that was maybe the area of Tarshish. Well, I said all that because they're mentioned in here. And we don't know exactly the relationship between Tyre way over on the east side and Tarshish way over on the west. It appears that there was some link. In fact, it might have been that Tyre kind of dominated the port of Tarshish. Maybe they had sent their troops, their navy over there and said, you're going to do things our way. You're going to be our exclusive port. You're going to trade with us, and all your business is going to, come to us, be a part of our wealth. We're not sure exactly what the situation is. But it appears that the Lord is saying, look, when Tyre falls, it's going to be felt in all these countries and all the way to the far end of the Mediterranean. And it either suggests that they too are going to come under great economic calamity, or they're going to fall apart, or maybe it means that the restraints of Tyre will fall off of Tarshish, and they won't be controlled so much anymore. Or maybe it's a little bit of both. They're going to have economic problems, but they're going to be free, and they can spill out over their land and look for work elsewhere, maybe go into other parts of Europe or sail to other ports or whatever. But that's how great the fall of Tyre was, that it was going to affect the entire Mediterranean port system. One of my commentaries imagined, we know how bad 9/11 was and how much hurt that brought to a lot of people, not to mention the people it killed, but economically, what it really hurt people for a while. Imagine if the whole city of New York was wiped out and it was no longer a port. That would seriously affect our country, but ports around the world would be affected by the loss of business out of New York City, or it could have been Los Angeles or some other great, maybe Mobile, I don't know. But great ports mean a lot to other countries, and Tyre is going to hurt a lot of people when God brings them down. But God is not only just and right in all he does, he's not only a righteous judge, God's also all powerful. Look at 13 and 14. Behold, the land of the Chaldeans. He's given an example. This is the people that was not. Assyria destined it for wild beasts. They erected their siege towers, they stripped her palaces bare, they made her a ruin. Wail, O ships of Tarshish, for your stronghold, that would be Tyre, is laid waste. In that day, Tyre will be forgotten for 70 years, like the days of one king, or the lifespan of one king. At the end of 70 years, it will happen to Tyre as in the song of the prostitute. Well, let's stop here a second. Back in verse 11, it talks about how God can stretch his hand over the sea. And then in verse 13, it talks about what happened to the Chaldeans. Well, God stretches his hand over the sea in this setting because Tyre is not on the coast of Lebanon. It's on a little island about a half a mile off the coast. And there was water, half a mile of water between the coastline of Lebanon and this really a good sized island that had a city of Tyre that had lots of ports and places where ships could put in and be safe. Okay, and that's what they looked for in those days. They couldn't build a harbor; they had to use natural ways to bring ships and bring them in the lee of the prevailing winds and that kind of thing, and of the tides, and so they had this island. Now Sidon is just a little 20 miles north of there or something, and it was on the coast, and it was a major city too. And they were kind of sister cities. They were both Phoenician cities. Well, nobody was able to destroy Tyre. It's all these land armies would march from everywhere across the land, and they would run into water. And they could see that city half a mile away, and that's an important city. It's a big port. We should take that city because they have a big navy. It's easier said than done. Okay, and what they're saying is what Isaiah is pointing out. It's not hard for God to reach across the water and deal with this city. Um, a half a mile of water is not hard for God. Now, in our day, with our view of God, we know He's creator of the world. We know He's creator of the universe, not just the Milky Way galaxy, but many, maybe millions, billions of other galaxies. We don't know how big it is. God made all that. A half a mile of water is not anything for God. But see, in their time, it was because most countries saw their gods as regional. They said these are our gods right here in our country. These are our gods, and they looked at that when they would battle another country, maybe an invading army, or they were invading their gods were doing battle against those people's gods. They were regional, it's like little demigods, and our demigods are bigger than your demigods. That kind of silliness, and so and so that's the way they viewed God, but that's not the God of Israel. He's the creator of everything. A half a mile of water is not an issue. God is bigger than that. And in this passage here in verse 13, God is saying, look what happened to the Chaldeans. Now, he doesn't give a lot of history. They know the history. He doesn't have to explain it. But just to let you know, the Chaldeans were from the area of Babylon. Now, Babylon is about to become, in the next 100 or 200 years, another great power again. But they had been a great power, referred to as the Chaldeans, and people thought, man, nobody can beat them. They're huge, they have big armies. The Assyrians defeated them and wiped them out, brought devastation to their palaces, to the city of Babylon. Now, his point is not that the Assyrians are great. His point is he used the Assyrians to make that happen. God can bring anybody to their knees. So, Judah, you don't think I can do this to Tyre? Look what I did to the Chaldeans. That's his message there. So, God is righteous in all he does. God's a judge, and he's just and he's right. God is all powerful. He can do as he pleases. Now, where does that lead us? Where do those two things lead us? The next thing is God's a righteous judge and God's all powerful, then he can do whatever righteous things he wants to do. He can do as he pleases. He can accomplish all of his righteous purposes. Look at these last few verses, 15 to 18 or 16 to 18. He just said in verse 15 that at the end of 70 years it will happen to Tyre as the song of the prostitute. In verse 16, take a harp. He's saying, talking to Judah as if he's talking to Tyre here. Tyre, take a harp and go about the city, O forgotten prostitute. Make sweet melody, sing many songs that you may be remembered. That's a pathetic picture. But let's go on. At the end of 70 years, the Lord will visit Tyre, and she will return to her wages, and will prostitute herself with all the kingdoms of the world on the face of the earth. Her merchandise and her wages will be holy to the Lord. It will not be stored or hoarded, but her merchandise will supply abundant food and fine clothing to those who dwell before the Lord. Now, what is he saying? He says, in that day. What day? The day Tyre falls. We don't know when that's going to be at this time. He's not giving us a clue, but we know when Tyre falls, it's going to be forgotten 70 years. Doesn't tell us how far off that is. And we don't know exactly. We speculate on the fulfillment of this prophecy. We know that Assyria, who was a world power at that time, tried to conquer Tyre, couldn't do it. Probably damaged them. Probably their assault from the shore. They found ways to damage some of their ships. They found ways to hurt the city, ways to hurt their shipping, but Tyre didn't fall. Now, we know something else, that almost 200 years after Isaiah is when Babylon rises up as a great power again, and Babylon comes, and that is when Jerusalem falls, and the Babylonians take a lot of the Hebrew people off to Babylon to live there, and they're in captivity for 70 years. There's that 70 years again. At the same time that they were doing that, he had an army over there attacking Tyre, and they laid siege to it for many years. They made life really difficult. Tyre didn't fall, but it was really hurt. In fact, the power of Babylon spread all the way down to Egypt. And it's very likely that Babylon made trade very difficult with Tyre because countries didn't want to have to come and deal with Babylonians. All right? Even though they could get to Tyre, life was difficult for the people of Tyre. Now, it's going to be about 400 years, I'll just tell you this real quick, before Tyre actually completely falls. It's going to be long after the children of Israel come back from captivity. A guy by the name of Alexander the Great is going to want to conquer Tyre. He knows nobody's ever really conquered him. And so he says, I'm not going to fool around with their navy and all this stuff. And he figures out a way. Remember, they're a half a mile off the coast. There's water, and it's relatively deep there. But science says that there was an area between the coast and Tyre where it wasn't as deep. It was more shallow, maybe a sandbar across there. The natural formation of the land kind of it came out to Tyre, but a lot of it was underwater. So for 7 months, Alexander had his army take debris and rock and boulders out there and just kept piling it, and they built a causeway across to the island, attacked, and Tyre fell. That's 400 years away. Let's back up now. Babylon had besieged and damaged Tyre, but Tyre didn't fall. And this idea of this prostitute walking through the streets trying to generate some business. This old, spent derelict of a prostitute that nobody wants anymore. It's this pathetic picture of her trying to find some way to make money. Is the picture of Tyre. That's how bad off they were. But they weren't utterly destroyed. Okay? Now, people of Israel start to return. A guy named Ezra comes back to help rebuild Jerusalem. They later are going to rebuild the temple. This is after 70 years, and about 70 years after Babylon had attacked Tyre. And listen to this. In Ezra chapter 3, verse 6, this is 250 years after Isaiah, 70 years after captivity in Babylon. Ezra 3:6, from the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord. They're back in Jerusalem and they have started the offerings. But the foundation of the temple of the Lord was not yet laid. So they gave money to masons and carpenters, and food and drink and oil to the Sidonians and the Tyrians, the people of Tyre, to bring cedar trees from Lebanon to the sea down to Joppa, according to the grant they had from Cyrus, king of Persia. Now, that's not all the details fulfilling everything that happens or was prophesied by Isaiah, but what we see is the beginning of Tyre and Sidon giving to the people of God. Now, God said this, go like a prostitute down the street, see if you can get business. Go ahead and try. You know when their business started up again? The Bible said it's when God visited. In verse 17, at the end of 70 years, the Lord will visit Tyre, and she will return to her wages. And yes, she's going to be wicked. She's going to prostitute herself to the world. She's going to export her false religion, maybe. But God is going to use her for his purposes. God is just in all he does. God is powerful, and God will accomplish his purposes. Now, let's recap a second. He's a just God. All his works are righteous. His face is towards his people. He's going to accomplish his righteous purposes with the people he has redeemed, the people he loves. He's an all-powerful God. No kingdom, no politics, no worldwide virus is too much for him. Okay? And he will accomplish all of his purposes. He will keep his promises. He will do as he pleases. He will do his will in the earth. And this whole passage, this whole text is an example of what we believe about God. It gives a basis to our theology of God and what we believe about God. Let me read you a short quote from the Baptist Faith and Message. This is the doctrinal statement of the Baptist Church. One little short quote about God. God is infinite in holiness and all other perfections. God is all powerful and all knowing, and his perfect knowledge extends to all things past, present, future, including the future decisions of his free creatures. And to him we owe the highest love and reverence and obedience. So, when God in his holiness brings justice on a nation, the people of God in that nation just might suffer, but their eternal standing with him is never threatened. You know, when things go difficult, in the midst of a storm, in the midst of a pandemic, we often hear people say, don't forget, God is on the throne. And that's good. That's a great reminder. But what does that tell us? That God is on the throne. You're not on the throne. I'm not on the throne. And God's on the throne. He may not do what you want. He may not do what I want. But he'll do righteously. He won't forget the children that he has redeemed. He will do all his will and he will carry it out. And we need to remind ourselves that he is on the throne and he may not do what we would like him to do, but he knows we're his children and he always will do what is right. Nothing will escape his eyes. Nothing is too hard for him to take care of. We serve that kind of God.